The 11-year-old boy lies flat against the sun-baked rocks above the rail corridor, squinting through the haze of a June afternoon in 1943. In his dirt-stained hands, he grips nothing but a cracked shaving mirror salvaged from the ruins of a bombed farmhouse. 200 meters below, a Soviet supply train grinds slowly westward, its cargo cars heavy with fuel drums and ammunition crates destined for the advancing Red Army. The boy exhales. He tilts the mirror toward the burning sun. And then, impossibly, the train erupts in flames. No dynamite, no resistance cell, no adult handlers. Just a child, a piece of broken glass, and the physics the Soviet Empire never imagined could be weaponized. This is not folklore. This is not a fairy tale. This is the buried story of how an 11-year-old orphan became one of the most disruptive saboteurs the Soviets never caught, and why his campaign has been erased from official history for 80 years. By the end of this account, you'll understand how a boy with nothing but curiosity and rage disrupted supply logistics across an entire military sector, and why Soviet intelligence never once profiled him as a threat. Before we understand how a child could turn sunlight into a strategic weapon, we need to understand the world that forced him to try. The western edge of the Soviet rear lines in 1943 was not a battlefield. It was a machine. The Red Army's westward advance consumed everything in its path: food, fuel, labor, loyalty. Villages that had survived centuries of occupation learned a new kind of survival under Soviet control. You kept your head down, you filled your quotas, you watched the trains roll past, and thanked God they weren't stopping for you. The trains were everywhere. Endless Soviet supply trains thundered day and night along the rail corridors, carrying the machinery of total war. T-34 tanks on flatbed cars, ammunition crates stacked 3 meters high, fuel drums welded to reinforced frames. These trains brought protection and power to some, and starvation, requisitions, and disappearances to others. In a village near one of these rail spurs, a boy named Mirek Koval lived with his uncle in a weathered stone cottage that had stood for 100 years. His parents were gone, taken early in the war, their fate unrecorded and unspoken. His uncle, a former surveyor quietly erased from official records, had taught Mirek to read, to calculate angles, to understand how light bends and reflects. Mirek was small for his age, wiry from hunger, with sharp eyes that watched everything and revealed nothing. His uncle kept him close, kept him quiet, and kept him alive by making him invisible. Life was measured. Life was cautious. You survived by blending into the background, by carrying firewood and scavenging scrap metal, and never, ever attracting Soviet attention. But Mirek had a problem. He couldn't stop watching the trains. He counted them. He memorized their schedules. He studied the way sunlight reflected off metal seals and fuel vents as they passed. And somewhere between observation and obsession, he began to burn with a question no 11-year-old should have to ask. If I can see them, can I hurt them? The trains haunted him, and eventually he learned to haunt them back. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, I need to know how this kid survives, how he calculates the angles, how he walks away from this without getting caught, then do me a favor, hit the subscribe button right now. Because Mirek Koval represents something rare, a person so overlooked, so underestimated, that he turned invisibility into his greatest weapon. If you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog, who believes intelligence and patience can beat brute force, who wants to see what happens when someone refuses to be helpless, then this channel is for you. We bring you the stories history tried to bury. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people. Every subscription helps us fund the research to find more Mirex. And every comment telling us where you're watching from, London, Lagos, Los Angeles, reminds us why we do this. So, show your support. Like this video, subscribe, and let's see how far a cracked mirror and a clear sky can really go. Back to the story. It started with an accident, or what looked like one. Mirek Koval was 11 years old the summer he learned that sunlight could burn through steel. He hadn't meant to discover it. He'd been crouched in the tall grass behind his uncle's cottage, trying to repair a cracked shaving mirror he'd pulled from the rubble of the WWII farmhouse 3 weeks earlier. The Dvoraks were gone, requisitioned for labor in some industrial complex near Minsk, or dead. No one really knew. What remained of their home had been picked clean by the village within days. Mirek had claimed the mirror because it was useless to everyone else. Half the silver backing had peeled away, the frame was snapped, and the reflection came out warped and doubled. But Mirek didn't need it to shave. He needed it because his uncle, Oldrin, had taught him that broken things still followed rules: geometry, angles, the behavior of light. Oldrin Koval had been a surveyor before the war, back when land records mattered and men like him were valued for their precision. Then the Soviets came, and precision became a liability. Maps were confiscated. Surveyors who knew too much about terrain, elevation, and sight lines were quietly removed from their posts, or from existence entirely. Oldrin had survived by becoming invisible, by keeping his head down and his nephew closer. He taught Mirek to read using old trigonometry tables. He taught him to calculate distances by counting paces and measuring shadows. And above all, he taught him to observe without speaking, to see without being seen. The trains became Mirek's classroom. Every day, Soviet supply trains thundered past the village on their way west. Fuel, ammunition, machinery, reinforcements. Mirek learned their schedules better than he knew his own hunger. The 6:14 morning freight, always late by 20 minutes. The 11:40 flatbed convoy, carrying tanks on reinforced cars. The 15:50 fuel line, slower and heavier, grinding uphill past the ridge where the Dvorak farm used to stand. The trains carried everything the Red Army needed. The village carried what was left. Grain quotas stripped the fields before harvest. Livestock vanished into requisition orders. Men disappeared into labor details and never returned. Power moved past suffering without noticing it. A iron certainty on iron rails, indifferent to the hollow faces watching from cottage doorways. Mirek watched. He counted. He memorized. And one afternoon, while angling that cracked mirror toward the sun, he saw something that made him stop breathing. The reflection, when focused just right, didn't just reflect. It burned. The mirror had survived a bomb that leveled the Dvorak farmhouse, and now it was teaching Mirek Koval how to start fires with nothing but air and light. He began with leaves, dry oak leaves from the previous autumn, still curled and brittle beneath the woodpile. He angled the mirror, adjusted the distance, and waited. Within seconds, a thin curl of smoke rose from the brown edge, then a spark, then flame. Mirek's hands didn't shake. They should have. He was 11, alone, playing with fire behind a cottage where discovery meant questions he couldn't answer. But his hands stayed steady because his mind was already moving forward, cataloging variables: angle, distance, surface material, sunlight intensity. He burned through a week of experiments. Pine bark scorched faster than oak. Dried moss caught almost instantly. A scrap of cloth from an old grain sack smoldered for 3 full minutes before igniting. He held the focused beam against a rusted nail and watched the metal darken from orange to black, the oxidation spreading like a stain. Light, he realized, was not gentle when you stopped it from scattering. Concentrated, it became something else entirely. Patient, invisible, hotter than his uncle's forge. Uldren noticed, of course. He noticed everything. One evening, as Mirek cleaned the mirror behind the woodshed, his uncle's shadow fell across the grass. "Lenses and mirrors," Uldren said quietly, not looking at the object in Mirek's hands, "were used by the old empires to signal across distances, light for communication, nothing more." Mirek said nothing. "Focused light," Uldren continued, his voice deliberate, "can also start fires. Surveyors knew this. We were taught to be careful during summer fieldwork. Instruments left, angled incorrectly, could ignite dry grass. Accidents happened." He paused, finally meeting Mirek's eyes. "Accidents have consequences. Not just for the person holding the mirror, for everyone nearby." Mirek understood the warning. He also understood his uncle hadn't taken the mirror away. That night, lying on his straw mattress, Mirek stared at the ceiling beams and thought about trains. Specifically, he thought about the 1550 fuel convoy, the one that labored uphill past the eastern ridge, slowing to a crawl on the curve where elevation forced the engine to strain. He thought about the way afternoon sunlight hit that section of track at a perfect angle between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. He thought about fuel drums, their seals exposed on open flat cars, metal heating under the June sun. He thought about vapor, pressure, ignition points. Curiosity, he realized, had become something heavier, something with direction and intent. The next morning, Mirek wrapped the mirror in an old cloth and buried it beneath a loose stone in the root cellar. It wasn't a toy anymore. It wasn't salvage. It was a weapon he hadn't asked for, but now couldn't stop thinking about. And the trains kept rolling past, indifferent and unaware. Mirek chose the eastern ridge because trains slowed there naturally, grinding uphill through a curve that forced even the heaviest engines to labor. No one would question why a boy might be in the hills above the tracks. Children scavenged everywhere, looking for scrap metal, fallen cargo, anything useful that the Soviets hadn't already claimed. He arrived 2 hours early. His hands were shaking. The mirror felt heavier than it should, wrapped in cloth and pressed against his chest beneath his jacket. He found a position in the rocks where the grass grew tall enough to break his silhouette, where he could see the tracks clearly but remain invisible from below. Then he waited. The 1550 fuel convoy was 12 minutes late. Mirek heard it before he saw it, the deep groan of the engine, the rhythmic clank of couplings, the metallic screech of wheels against rails on the curve. 6 flatbed cars, each carrying fuel drums lashed to reinforced frames. The seals were visible even from his position, dark circles against sun-bleached metal. He unwrapped the mirror. His hands were still shaking. The sun was perfect, high enough for intensity, angled just right to reach the tracks. Mirek raised the mirror, found the reflection, and tried to hold it steady on the third fuel car. The beam danced and skipped. He'd practiced on stationary targets for days, but the train was moving, vibrating, and his hands wouldn't cooperate. He almost gave up, almost re-wrapped the mirror and climbed down, convinced this was insane, impossible, that children didn't sabotage empires with sunlight. Then the beam locked onto a fuel seal for 3 full seconds. Nothing happened. Then smoke, thin, gray, barely visible. Then a lick of orange flame, small and uncertain. Then the fuel drum erupted. The fire spread to the adjacent drum, before Mirek could process what he was seeing. Black smoke poured skyward. The train didn't stop immediately. It continued forward for another 50 meters, before the engineer noticed, before emergency brakes screamed, and the entire convoy shuddered to a halt. Mirek was already running. He didn't look back. He crashed through the undergrowth, stumbled down the far side of the ridge, and didn't stop until he reached the tree line near his uncle's cottage. His lungs burned. His legs felt like water. He buried the mirror in the root cellar with dirt still under his fingernails. That evening, Soviet troops arrived in the village. They questioned farmers, searched tool sheds, and examined the rail line for evidence of explosives. They found none. The official report, whispered through the village by morning, blamed mechanical failure, possibly partisan interference, methodology unknown. Mirek sat at his uncle's table that night, unable to eat. Oldren said nothing, but his eyes carried a weight Mirek now understood. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the cold realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't see until it was already behind him. Knowledge once gained couldn't be unlearned, and innocence once spent didn't return. The second strike came 11 days later, then a third, then a fourth. Mirek learned to vary his approach. Different ridges, different times, different sections of track where terrain and sun angles aligned. Not every attempt succeeded. Twice, clouds rolled in at the critical moment. Once, a fuel seal proved too thick, the ignition too slow, and the train passed before flame took hold. But enough worked. A fuel car on the morning freight burned for 20 minutes before crews extinguished it, delaying the convoy by 3 hours. An ammunition transport experienced what Soviet reports called spontaneous thermal ignition on a curve south of the village. Minor damage, but enough to force a full cargo inspection that paralyzed the line for an entire day. And once, on a slow-moving supply train climbing the steepest grade, a fire spread quickly enough to force an emergency uncoupling. The abandoned cars rolled backward, derailing on a switching junction and blocking the corridor for nearly a week. Soviet counterintelligence arrived within the month. They were efficient, methodical, and completely wrong. Officers questioned former Polish Army veterans first, then rail workers, then anyone with engineering knowledge. They searched the forests for partisan camps that didn't exist. They set up observation posts watching for adult saboteurs approaching the tracks with explosives, radio equipment, cutting tools, anything that matched their training, their profiles, their understanding of how resistance worked. Mirek walked past their checkpoints carrying bundles of firewood. He was small, thin, hollow-eyed from hunger like every other village child. Soldiers glanced at him the way they glanced at fence posts, objects in the landscape beneath notice, irrelevant to investigations targeting dangerous men. One afternoon, an officer stopped him to ask if he'd seen any strangers in the hills. Mirek said no, eyes down, voice quiet. The officer waved him on without a second thought. The ghost they hunted didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a victim. Oldren never asked directly, but Mirek noticed things. His uncle's careful tracking of train schedules, the way he'd glance at the sky each morning, assessing cloud cover, how he'd tense slightly when Soviet patrols passed too close to the eastern ridge. One evening, after another unexplained rail incident appeared in whispered reports, Oldren placed a hand on Mirek's shoulder. "Accidents," he said quietly, "draw attention. Patterns draw investigations. Surveyors understand intervals, variation, but the importance of appearing random." Mirek nodded. His uncle's hand stayed in place a moment longer, then withdrew. Nothing else was said. Nothing needed to be. The silent agreement formed like frost, gradual, inevitable, impossible to mark the exact moment it became solid. Systems, Mirek was learning, failed when imagination failed. The Soviets had entire doctrines for catching saboteurs, procedures, protocols, expertise built over decades of combating resistance. But those doctrines assumed enemies looked like enemies, that threats came in recognizable shapes. They had no doctrine for an 11-year-old boy carrying firewood. And so the fires kept burning, and the investigators kept searching forests where no one hid. Iron Bend earned its name from the way metal screamed against metal. A long, grinding curve where the track climbed nearly 40 meters over half a kilometer. Engines labored. Convoys slowed to walking pace. And on clear afternoons, the western sun hit the rails at an angle that turned every exposed surface into a mirror. Mirek had been watching Iron Bend for 3 weeks when the high-value fuel convoy appeared on the schedule, whispered about by rail workers, visible in the increased Soviet security presence, confirmed by the unusual timing, a slow, heavily loaded transport scheduled for mid-afternoon when traffic normally thinned. He prepared like his uncle had taught him to survey land, methodically, accounting for every variable. He scouted 3 positions, tested sight lines at different times, calculated sun angles against the train's projected speed. He chose a rocky outcrop 200 meters above the midpoint of the curve, where the convoy would be slowest, where fuel cars would be bunched together on the incline, where escape routes led in 3 directions. The day arrived cloudless and bright. Mirek reached his position 90 minutes early. The mirror, now wrapped in leather he'd carefully darkened with dirt, felt like an extension of his hand. No shaking this time, no hesitation. He'd done this too many times to be afraid. But this was different, larger, more dangerous. The convoy appeared at 15:23, 11 cars heavy with fuel drums, moving at barely 5 kilometers per hour. Mirek waited until the 4th car entered the curve's midpoint. Maximum vulnerability, minimum speed. Then he raised the mirror and locked the beam onto a seal already discolored by sun exposure and vibration. 6 seconds. That's all it took. The first drum ignited with a muffled whoomp that Mirek felt in his chest, even at distance. Flame spread to the adjacent drum before crews noticed. Then to the car behind it, poorly maintained seals rupturing under heat and pressure, fuel vapor igniting in a chain reaction that turned 1 fire into 5. The entire convoy stopped. Emergency crews appeared, but the fire had momentum now, spreading faster than extinguishers could contain. Black smoke poured into the sky, like a signal flare visible for kilometers. By the time they controlled it, 3 cars were destroyed, 2 more damaged beyond immediate use, and the track itself compromised by heat distortion. The line stayed closed for 4 days. Soviet command issued new classifications that night. This was no longer mechanical failure, no longer random partisan harassment. The threat was reclassified as strategic, coordinated, targeted, and disturbingly effective. Checkpoints multiplied, curfews tightened, and 3 villages near the rail corridor, including Mirek's, were placed under food rationing as collective punishment. Quotas increased, distributions decreased, a reminder that Soviet authority answered disruption with suffering. Mirek heard the announcement from inside his uncle's cottage, listening to soldiers read the orders in the village square. Families who were already hungry would now starve a little more. Children who were already thin would grow thinner, because of fires he had started, because he was no longer invisible, His actions were too visible now, burning holes in Soviet logistics that someone somewhere would eventually trace back to their source. The reprisals came like winter, slow at first, then inescapable. Food seizures doubled within a week. Soviet requisition teams stripped storage cellars that families had hidden for months, taking grain reserves meant to last until harvest. The official reason was supply reallocation due to partisan activity in the region. Everyone understood the real message. Someone was causing problems, and everyone would pay until the problems stopped. Then the arrests began. 3 men from the village were taken for questioning: Yarek the blacksmith, old Piotr, who'd been a railway worker before the war, and Stefan Nowak, whose only crime was being young enough to be suspected and old enough to be blamed. Yarek returned after 2 days, his hands broken. Piotr didn't return at all. Stefan came back changed, silent, hollow-eyed, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Mirek knew their names. He'd known them his entire life. Yarek had once repaired his uncle's wood axe for free. Piotr had given him apples from a tree behind his cottage. Stefan had a daughter, 6 years old, who now waited by her door every evening, watching for a father who barely recognized her anymore. One night, Oldren found Mirek sitting behind the woodshed, staring at nothing. His uncle sat beside him without speaking for a long time. Then quietly, "You understand what's happening?" It wasn't a question. Mirek nodded. "They will keep tightening the grip," Oldren continued. "Every fire you light, they will answer with pressure on people who have nothing to do with it, people who don't even know you exist." He paused. "I'm not telling you to stop. I'm telling you to carry what comes next." "How do you carry that?" Mirek's voice cracked. "How do you hurt people who did nothing wrong and still call it resistance?" Oldren was quiet for a moment. "You don't call it anything. You just decide whether submission is worse." The words settled like stones. Mirek stopped for 11 days. He buried the mirror deeper, avoided the ridges, kept his eyes down when trains passed. He watched the village hollow out, children growing thinner, families rationing meals into smaller and smaller portions, the collective weight of punishment for fires they didn't start and couldn't stop. Then on the 12th day, he heard another train, the 1140 flatbed convoy carrying tanks and artillery pieces westward. He knew its schedule, its route, the section where it slowed through a narrow valley. He knew exactly where sunlight would hit exposed fuel lines on the tanks themselves. Mirek stood at the crossroads behind his cottage, listening to the distant thunder of iron wheels on iron rails. The choice wasn't clean. Resistance never was. It wasn't noble or pure or free of consequences. It was heavy, a weight that pressed down on everyone it touched, guilty and innocent alike. But submission, he realized, was heavier still. He retrieved the mirror from the root cellar. His hands didn't shake this time. They couldn't afford to. Mirek had never tried to hit a moving target before. Every previous strike had relied on trains grinding slowly uphill, barely faster than a walking pace. But the 1140 flatbed convoy didn't slow through the valley. It maintained speed, thundering through open terrain where momentum mattered more than elevation. Hitting it would require something beyond precision. It would require prediction. He positioned himself on a low hill overlooking a straight section of track where the convoy would pass at nearly 40 kilometers per hour. The tanks lashed to the flatbeds were older models, T-34s with external fuel drums mounted on the rear deck. A design flaw Soviet logistics had never bothered to fix. Those drums had rubber seals that degraded under sun exposure and constant vibration. Mirek had been watching them for weeks, learning their vulnerabilities the way his uncle had taught him to read elevation maps. The mathematics were brutal. He had to account for the train's speed, the vibration of the cars, the micro-movements of his own breathing. The beam had to lead the target, focused not where the seal was, but where it would be in 3 seconds. One miscalculation, one tremor in his hands, and the light would skip harmlessly across metal. The convoy appeared at 11:43, right on schedule. 8 flatbeds, each carrying 2 tanks. Mirek exhaled slowly, raised the mirror, and tracked the 3rd car. His hands moved with the train, smooth, continuous, matching speed and rhythm. The focused beam locked onto an external fuel drum for 2 seconds. 3, 4, nothing. Then smoke, thin and white against the tank's dark green hull. Then flame, small but growing, fed by leaking vapor. Then the fuel drum exploded. The blast tore through the mounting bracket, sending debris into the wheels of the flatbed car behind it. At walking speed, the damage would have been containable. At 40 kilometers per hour, it was catastrophic. The trailing car lurched, its wheels catching the debris and jumping the rails. Momentum became the enemy. The derailing car dragged the one behind it sideways, which pulled the next, and suddenly 4 flatbeds were tumbling off the track in a chain reaction of twisted metal and splintering wood. The corridor was blocked completely. Tanks lay on their sides like dead insects. Rail crews would need days, maybe weeks, to clear the wreckage. Somewhere to the west, Soviet armored units waited for reinforcements that would never arrive on schedule. Battles were fought with fewer tanks than planned. Ground was lost during windows that shouldn't have existed. The war shifted, and no one knew why. Soviet investigators descended on the site within hours. They found no explosives residue, no sabotage equipment, no evidence of tampering. The official report cited structural failure under load, possibly compromised by prior partisan activity. But senior officers weren't satisfied. Someone drew correlations, clear weather, specific sun angles, elevated positions near strike sites. The theory was discussed, then dismissed as improbable. By the time they might have believed it, autumn clouds were rolling in. Mirek watched the sky darken from his uncle's doorway. Rain fell for 3 days straight, then intermittent cloud cover for a week. The mirror became useless, sunlight too weak, too scattered, too unreliable. Routes began changing. Patrols intensified near elevated positions. The operational window closed like a door he couldn't reopen. His campaign ended not with capture, but with weather and adaptation. The trains kept rolling, but some of them rolled later than they should have, and in war, timing was everything. The clouds came in November and didn't leave. Mirek watched from the cottage doorway as gray skies settled over the rail corridor like a lid closing on a box. Rain turned the ridges muddy and treacherous. When the sun did break through, it was weak, diffused, unable to concentrate the way he needed. He tried twice, once in a brief window of clear weather, once in desperation during partial cloud cover. Both times the beam scattered uselessly across metal that should have burned. The mirror had become a relic of summer. Routes changed, too. Soviet logistics rerouted high-value convoys through different corridors, away from elevated terrain, away from the sections where unexplained fires had clustered. Patrols increased near every ridge and outcrop that offered sightlines to the tracks. Soldiers walked the hills now, watching for watchers, searching for an enemy they still couldn't define. Mirek's operational window had closed, not dramatically. No final chase, no desperate last strike, no confrontation that would make a satisfying ending to a story. Just weather, adaptation, and the quiet acknowledgement that his war was over. He survived. His uncle did not. Oldrin died in February, not from Soviet reprisal, but from pneumonia that winter cold and rationed food made inevitable. He was buried in the village cemetery under a wooden marker that listed no profession, no history, just his name and dates. Mirek stood at the grave alone, understanding that the only person who had known the truth was gone. He buried the mirror beside the root cellar 3 days later, wrapped in oiled cloth, under stones that would outlast memory. The war ended. Mirek grew up unnoticed, unmarked, carrying knowledge he never spoke aloud. He worked as a laborer, then a railway clerk, close enough to trains to remember, far enough from significance to remain invisible. Decades passed. In 1982, a military researcher analyzing wartime logistics noticed anomalies in Soviet rail reports from the 1943-44 period. Incident logs described fires and derailments that defied standard sabotage patterns. No explosives residue, no tool marks, clusters of attacks during clear weather that ceased abruptly each winter. The researcher published a footnote in an obscure journal, suggesting unexplained thermal ignition events possibly attributable to unknown resistance methodology. No one followed up. The evidence was too scattered, too improbable. The explanation, if it even existed, had been buried with the witnesses. Mirek Koval died in 1987, his role unclaimed and undocumented. The mirror remained under stones that no one had reason to move. History remembers armies, their movements, their generals, their decisive battles that pivot the world. It remembers resistance networks, partisan commanders, saboteurs whose names made it into official reports. It forgets children. It forgets the boy who aimed light at power and disappeared before anyone thought to look down instead of across. It forgets that empires, for all their intelligence and force, can be disrupted by someone too small to profile, too improbable to imagine. Mirek understood something the Soviets never did. You don't need to be visible to be dangerous. You just need to understand angles, patience, and the places where no one thinks to look. The trains kept rolling for decades after. But some of them, just a few, rolled later than they should have, and no one ever knew why. This story teaches that power is not always force, it is understanding. Empires prepare for enemies that look like enemies. They fail against threats they cannot imagine. The Soviets had protocols for partisan cells, explosives experts, and trained saboteurs. They had no protocol for an 11-year-old boy with a mirror. Mirek's story reminds us that resistance is not heroic fantasy. It is moral weight. Every fire he started echoed outward in circles he couldn't control. Innocent people suffered. Villages paid for his defiance. He carried that burden alone, without glory, without recognition, forced to decide whether submission was worse than the harm his actions caused. This is the part of resistance history rarely tells: the sleepless nights, the faces of neighbors punished for your choices, the understanding that courage and consequence are inseparable. But Mirek also proves something empires fear: that scale is not destiny. You don't need armies to disrupt logistics. You don't need weapons to cause strategic delays. You need observation, patience, and the willingness to act when everyone else assumes powerlessness. Sometimes the smallest act, done with intelligence, precision, and courage, can bend forces that seem unmovable. Because darkness does not fear strength. It fears focus, and focus, unlike armies or empires, can fit in the hands of a child. Stories like this get buried not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient. An 11-year-old disrupting an empire with a mirror doesn't fit the official version of how power works. That's exactly why we tell them. This channel exists to uncover the stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about resistance, survival, and human ingenuity. The forgotten saboteurs, the invisible heroes, the moments where ordinary people, often children, refused to be powerless. If you want more stories that will make you rethink what's possible, hit that subscribe button right now. Because for every Mirek Koval whose story we managed to piece together, there are dozens more still buried in classified files and forgotten footnotes. And speaking of stories that defy belief, the video appearing on your screen right now will take you even deeper into the world of unlikely resistance. If you thought a boy with a mirror was impossible, wait until you see what comes next. Click it. You won't regret it. Because history's most powerful lessons are the ones they tried to erase.